So, our second part of this first session is going to start with a keynote from Finland's Defense Minister, Antti Häkkänen. He's previously served as Minister for Justice, as well as the committees on constitutional law, defense, and about 5 other ones, which are not all listed. But Minister Häkkänen, the stage and floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Charlie. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished minister colleagues, pleasure to be here talking with this highly appreciated seminar. But first of all, we are on the brink of a new era. The post-Cold War age has come to an end. A great reshuffle of security architecture is ongoing in various fields of Europe also, but also globally. Nations, blocs and cultures prepare to choose their sides in this new world. Military spending is growing worldwide. The world is changing so fast that even the most advanced nations have difficulties to keep up. Russia's decline to autocracy did not come out of the blue, like we heard from the Prime Minister Kaja Kallas here. However, it is staggering how swiftly Russia degraded to lawlessness, launched brutal military operations in full scale, and disregarded totally the rules-based world order. The post-Cold War era of peace and cooperative security fooled the Western world, especially in Europe, to a false sense of security. Only after 1.5 years of war in Ukraine, Europe is now slowly starting to wake up and take action. The deprioritizing of defense capabilities in Europe has led to diminished militaries and insufficient defense industrial base. The American criticism of Europeans not investing in their defense has merit. Now it's the time to Europe to take security seriously, take defense seriously. Finland is also opening a new page in history. The decision to join the North Atlantic Treaty Organization completely changed our security policy's fundamentals. The deterrence provided by NATO is the key now. Our defense has relied on deterrence even before the invasion of Ukraine. After the Second World War, Finland was in a very challenging position. The whole country had one focus, stopping the Soviet offensive, and fortunately, we prevailed. However, after the war, the Soviet pressure was strong, and no cooperative defense arrangements could be made with the Western nations. Finland was alone during the Cold War. Therefore, it was decided that our future defense would be based upon neutrality, backed by independent national defense. The defense forces would be developed to an extent that they would not pose a threat to Soviet Union, but still would be strong enough to deter the Soviets from invading Finland. Luckily, our ability to defend was never tested. The deterrence worked. Today's Russia is different from the Soviet Union. Whereas both have always used military power to assert their dominance, Russia has also developed into an unpredictable and aggressive entity. Our doctrine of independent defense and friendly neighborly relations could not be relied anymore. Our membership in NATO arises from this revelation. As a NATO member, we will continue to maintain and invest in our own defense. The difference is now that if Russia goes, in poker terms, all in against us, we have the world's strongest military alliance to cover our back. And let me assure you, there is a world of difference between being only a partner and being a member. Article 5 of the NATO Charter is the key now. Because of our history of independent defense, we have extremely detailed and comprehensive set of national defense plans. Our immediate and urgent need is now to streamline, coordinate and adapt our plans to NATO's regional plans. We will not fix anything that is not broken. And ladies and gentlemen, big question is now, how will Finland position itself in the alliance? Let us look at NATO's three main tasks. Of course, our focus is in the collective defense. We will do our best to contribute and participate in all efforts concerning collective defense. We have noticed with pleasure that NATO has returned to its roots. That is the military defense of the Euro-Atlantic sphere. For us, this could mean increased participation in exercises or operations. One of NATO's core functions is nuclear planning. This is naturally completely new to us. We plan to participate fully in nuclear planning group, all activities, increasing our knowledge and understanding in the same time. In crisis management, we have a long tradition operating in NATO's framework. We do not see any significant changes in this. However, troop numbers and geographical areas may vary, depending on the current situation. Collective security can be understood in many ways. In its widest form, collective security can be interpreted as NATO's and its members' joint and coordinated actions to first work in order to avoid crises to escalate to full-scale war. And secondly, in case of war, coordinate and mutually repel armed incursions against allies. Collective security can also be understood as coordinated political and diplomatic efforts, combined with distinct military aspects in order to maintain peace and stability. These could include armed control, support of internal security in potential crisis areas, and possible coercive measures to prevent the outbreak of hostilities. It is natural for us to support and fully contribute to these goals. Ladies and gentlemen, in the Vilnius summit, it was agreed that NATO will continue to strengthen defense and deterrence assets and activities. It was also agreed that members will strive to meet NATO's minimum defense spending level after decades of underinvestment. Finally, allies agreed to continue Ukraine's strong support and increase it in all possible fields. As an individual member state, we are able to meet all these goals. We are strongly investing in defense. In spite of the difficult economical situation of our country, our defense budget is now 2.5% of GDP. We fulfill the spending level requirement, and this government is committed to meet the level also going forward. There are various large-scale modernization programs ongoing in our defense forces. A new class of corvettes is built for the Navy. In the air defense side, we will replace our fleet of F-18 fighters with state-of-the-art F-35s in coming years. When these programs are coming to their end, we strive to focus our spending on land forces major renovation program. We continue to support Ukraine. The net worth of our aid so far exceeds 1.3 billion euros. Altogether, 18 packages has been sent, and the 19th package is being prepared in our government. Due to our relatively large reserve, we have been able to donate vast amounts of expendable bulk material, such as ammunition that some other allies are maybe lacking now. although this doesn't mean that our aid is limited to only bulk material. We understand that joining the alliance is not financial free ride. It will imply significant costs. The renewed focus on collective defense means increased financial burden for all allies. This may mean difficult decisions when forming the national budget in these times. Even so, I am confident that we will meet our goals and invest in national defense as well as in NATO. Ladies and gentlemen, we have a unique defense system here in Finland. We draw our strength in defense from the whole of government approach to all defense matters. Our citizens' willingness to defend our country is the highest in whole Europe. Our defense forces are relatively cost-effective with conscription and large reserve element. What we need to build and develop is the new mindset. Our defense from now on is defense of the whole alliance, not just our own land. We recognize our responsibilities in the alliance and understand what is expected from us. We are also aware of our strengths and capabilities and look forward to work together with our new allies. Finland will be militarily capable, prominent member in NATO. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Minister Häkkänen. And now comes all the freedom we would want and an opportunity for the audience to ask questions. So if I can ask our panelists, Heather Conley and Sten to come up here. Heather is, as I said, the president of the German Marshall Fund. Prior to this, she spent about a decade at CSIS. She's also served the American Red Cross. And in 2001, 2005, she was the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State at the U.S. Department. And Sten is a professor and vice dean, as I said, at the University of Southern Denmark, director of the Danish Institute of Advanced Studies. He's been at countless official commissions looking at Danish international operations. In 2021, he's going to hate me for saying this, but he was made a Knight of the Order of Dannebrog, for that, and everyone should, right after this panel, go and look up and pre-order his coming book, History of NATO, which will be published by Yale just before next year's summit, I guess. So, with those words, let's get started. Let's go first to Sten. NATO has deterred, defend Europe before, the Cold War. Why shouldn't we just trust that it used to be able to do it, it can do it again? Has something in NATO's fundamental character changed? Should we be worried?
Well, thank you, Charlie, for the kind introduction. And I think, yes, we should be a little bit worried, just a little bit. When I look at the trend in NATO decision-making, one of the striking things, I think, is that during the Cold War, those first 40 years, NATO held 8 summits. The first summit was held in 1957. Since 1989, counting the 2 summits now in the cards in Washington and in the Netherlands, NATO will have held 30 summits after the end of the Cold War. So NATO has gotten addicted to summitry. And the pace is quickening. If the way things are going, NATO will have held 7 summits by 2025. So in the 2020s, NATO will probably have held more than 10 summits, which will be a record-breaking fast pace of summitry. Now, you may say that this is a good thing, because having the chiefs come together, they make compromises, they command attention, they make decisions. But actually, I think it's a sign of weakness that you have to bring the chiefs together so often at such a high pace. And I think we see it. I think we see an erosion of trust in what NATO used to be, which was an alliance of ministers of foreign affairs and ministers of defense. Today, it is an alliance of chiefs. They don't trust their prime minister or their ministers of foreign affairs and of defense to actually run the alliance. which has to do with the nature of domestic coalitions. They have become much more feeble, much more disputed, much more struck by identity politics. And that creates in NATO an erosion of policy community. So NATO's horizon, planning horizon, has shortened to the next summit. I'm being very crude, so I apologize to all those policy people who do great work. But that's the trend. The next summit cannot fail. The chiefs have to look good. And the final outcome of this, I think, is that NATO has become slightly more marginal to the big questions of European security. Yes, NATO defends and deters, but NATO doesn't really command a voice in the big issues of European security. And notice the distinction between defense and deterrence and security. Security is what in the old days they called European settlement. Where should defense and deterrence take us in terms of a continental settlement? Those questions, the continental settlement, are now being dealt with outside of NATO. In informal formats, in the Quad, in the G7, they are not really discussed at NATO because they're too difficult, the chiefs cannot manage them, and that escapes NATO. And I don't think that's a good thing. So if we worry about NATO, or if we care about NATO, we should hope that NATO stops having so many summits and manages to rebuild the policy community that can actually look ahead and look into the security architecture and act on it.
All right. Thank you. I think that woke up a few people in the audience, and maybe Heather too. Now, yes, it is an alliance of equals, but then some allies are more equal than others, as it were. So the US remains indispensable to European security. NATO's deterrence, defense is built on it, but also nowadays, Ukraine's to a large degree. So keeping in mind what the Finnish ministers have said, what Sten just said, could you give us some words of either comfort or scare us even more, considering what we see in domestic U.S. politics and coming elections?
Well, thank you so much. It's great to be here, and to foot stomp, it is great to be on NATO soil in Helsinki. So great to see lots of colleagues. May I just respond very briefly to Sten, because I game on. Let's go. You know, you're right, leaders do have to decide this because of the blurring of domestic and foreign policy. You're absolutely right. The foreign ministers and the defense ministers have lost power over time because the leaders have to make those decisions. That's understandable. And you're absolutely right, flexible geometry. In fact, I would argue our diplomacy is really stuck in the past, and a lot of people are moving faster, more agile, and we're a little shocked at how quickly this is moving. It's not quite to pace. But I think it's a good thing for leaders to meet annually. It moves things along, but I think you're right. I was at the Vilnius summit. In fact, I moderated a panel where Prime Minister Kallas was. She does such a fantastic job. It is higher stakes because now everyone is focusing on what those deliverables are. But I would really contest your view that NATO isn't at the center of European security right now. I think it absolutely is. At the center. I think it's been slow, much too slow post-2014 to adapt. The very, very high readiness, how ready can we be? Because maybe this is coming in the 30x4s or 4x30s. And, you know, we have had all these tools. Now, with the regional defense plans, countries have got to put it on the line. And I think this is going to be the shock to leaders. The panel that we were discussing, the big thing that came out of the Vilnius summit that people weren't focusing on, understandably, was regional defense plans. So that's where the rubber is going to meet the NATO defense road. So let's talk a little bit about the US. So in my conversations with Finnish colleagues here this week, which has been fascinating, I sort of, with their help and stealing their great insights, sort of, this is my my context for the United States, and now Finland is our 31st member. So for Finland, NATO is in their head, but it's not in their muscles. their muscles are territorial defense, so they've got Article 3, great. They're going to have new muscles to go into a collective defense posture, a new culture to go into that posture. I would argue the U.S. is a little bit the opposite. NATO is all in our muscles, and it's our reflex. We've been losing it in our head a little bit. We've been losing the importance of NATO to U.S. national security. And we certainly, and this is sort of my flow back to your comment, what's been happening is the loss of trust in institutions and political leaders. We're losing that trust as we're explaining why NATO is important. So we have a generation in the United States that doesn't care about NATO, doesn't know about NATO, doesn't really want to know about NATO. That's something for others. We have to bring this to the local level and inform our citizens, exactly what the Prime Minister Oppo was saying, democracy and how to explain this. So this gets back to 2024 election, and what does that mean? If you've lost sight of why NATO is important to U.S. national security, and you continue to see where other NATO partners have not been paying their weight in defense spending, and it feels like a burden, and then it becomes free riding, and then you ripping us off, and then it becomes a grievance-based approach. If no one's fighting that narrative, if no one's saying no, this enhances U.S. security, then you wonder why our politics get a little weird on this one. And yes, it's certainly a part of our discussion, but I'll end on a note that I cling to. This relationship is too deep, too vast, too important, too historic to let one individual wreck it. Now, there's a lot of damage that can be done, we know that, but it's too important, and we've got to fight harder for it.
All right, I think we can all stand behind that. I'm going to have a philosophical question, but then go directly to questions. I'm going to take, just so everyone knows, 2 to 4 questions. The shorter your questions, the more I can take. But a philosophical question, we can talk about it for hours, but maybe a really short answer. When we're discussing securing Europe, who and what has to be secured? The people, the companies, the cities, geographic space? What?
Well, I think, you're always provocative there, Charlie, but I think the answer is that these are our societies. So these are our citizens and our companies and the governments, they represent them. And again, I'm led back to sort of the thinking of the Cold War, the Harmel Compromise in NATO, that defense and deterrence is a means, it's not an end. And the end must be a European settlement that creates better conditions for our societies. And NATO back then had the capacity to reflect on the European settlement. And the reason why I'm sort of being critical is that I don't see this same capacity today in NATO, because it is that energy to think about the European settlement is elsewhere, and maybe it's not there. And I think that really does not do well for NATO. So it was just a broad comment on that, and I agree, this has been coming for a while. I really see the end of the Afghan surge in 2011 as the starting point of this. So it's not just a Trump phenomenon. Trump rode on that wave, and the NATO 2030 agenda of Secretary General Stoltenberg was meant to deal with this, but I don't think it would have been very successful had there not been a war in Ukraine. And so we're still waking up to a political sense of direction in NATO that we lost more than a decade ago.
Okay, everybody, I'm going to give you permission to whip out your phones, Google the Washington Treaty, and read the preamble. That is your answer. Read it.
Excellent advice. So, who wants to be the first? Okay, see, we have the first microphone here. And next question. So we can get the, okay, here. John.
Thank you so much, Salma Baba from New Delhi, India. I've come a long way.
Yes, you have.
I do Europe. Okay, Sten, you said addicted to symmetry. There have only been 8 strategic concepts, 4 during the Cold War period and 4 thereafter. If the strategic concepts are long-term maps every 10 years, then summits are the way to build trust, not a way to say a trust dissonance is taking place.
All right.
Me on the back, at the back. Thank you so much, Anna Tervahartila from Helsinki.
Could you just also, I'm sorry, could you also say where you're from in terms of
Affiliation.
organization?
I work at Human Rights Watch, and I'm also an independent editor on security topics.
Okay, thank you.
I'd be very fascinated to hear your thoughts on the ongoing discussions with Turkey and the learnings of it, especially regarding the, one could say, soul searching that needs to happen within NATO. So your thoughts on, hopefully once Sweden joins NATO, what have we learned? And what needs to happen so that such delays or haggling does not continue going on in the turbulent years to come?
We'll take third one right here. Yeah. Right here. I thought.
Yeah, Michael. As we started a couple of hours ago, we were listening to the presidential candidates, and they were of the opinion that we did not fully appreciate the risks that, which were materialized in February 2022. And my question is it lack of information? Is it a poor interpretation of the facts we have? Or is it unwillingness to accept the fact that we see? In other words, a political judgment. How would you react to this observation?
Thank you. Three deep questions. Who wants to take a first crack on?
I'm happy to go very quickly. And you're right, strategic concepts, any strategic document, the white paper that will be produced soon, is your roadmap and how you implement it moving forward. I couldn't agree with you more. The Turkey question, very briefly, and it could be a conference and a seminar in itself, we are paying a dear, dear price for our overuse of transactionalism in diplomacy until we lose the value of what we're trying to accomplish. And in order to avoid difficult summits and not having those deliverables ready, we compromise until I think we train our allies and partners, here's an opportunity, rather than focusing on the strategic imperative of the strengthening of the collective defense of the organization. When will it stop? Until we say no more, and we just haven't reached that point yet. I was at the Munich Security Conference last year, about a week before the full-scale invasion happened, and I have to tell you, it was an extraordinary experience where every American in excruciating detail was describing the intelligence and going through, this is going to happen, this is going to happen, and most of our European colleagues said, nope, not going to happen, never going to happen, even when it was very clear. And I think this points to, and the United States also does this as well, particularly as a government. We need stability, we want stability, and we will tell ourselves and work towards that stability. But as Prime Minister Kala said, sometimes the price of that stability is too great. And so this is where those difficult decisions that we don't want to take, sanctions, they harm our economy. Our citizens are hurting. We don't want to do that. And confronting this now, and this is where my concern, particularly with U.S. policy, we are not explaining sufficiently the costs if Ukraine is unsuccessful. If we have political leaders concerned about spending 5% of U.S. defense spending on providing weapons to Ukraine, if they fail, we better watch our defense spending go right up. And if Russia is victorious and stalemating this contest, we have just strengthened China, we have strengthened North Korea, we have strengthened Iran. This is where it's missing in our conversation. So we all don't want this unpleasantness, but we have to confront it.
I think essentially it's a question of human imagination, and we've been through at least 30 years where the main gist of our human imagination has gone into generic issues, globalization, transnational issues, institution building, multilateralism, big issues that know of no geography, terrorism, weapons proliferation. And again, it's without geography. And geography tells you about who wants what and what might they do to you. And we have let that side of our human imagination wither. And that has not been good for us. It has prevented us from reading Russia in an area studies perspective. What kind of state is this? What could be their ambition? And so we were taken by surprise, especially in Europe, I think. I think the same goes to the Middle East, where what has unfolded in Syria has been tremendously hurtful to Turkey. And I think Turkey has experienced that its NATO allies has not always been on the same page as Turkey, and that has spilled over into NATO, and we're still living with that. So again, it's sort of a lack of imagination when it comes to how things are connected. And no, I don't think it's about having leaders meet as often as possible so they can build trust, because ultimately you want this policy community to imagine where it is heading or how it deals with challenges. And too many meetings just slowdowns the digestion. And I think the strategic concepts we've seen in NATO, they tend to codify a lot. So they are not these very strategic documents that we pretend they are. And every summit, by the way, you will see that it comes wrapped in the rhetoric of this is historic, it's groundbreaking, enormous. But that's because the chiefs are gathered. It has to be groundbreaking. But in fact, it's not. And strategic concepts are not always strategic. And so to fill in the gaps, you need a policy community that can imagine architecture beyond symmetry. And that would be what I would wish for NATO.
So we need more mission command at NATO, as it were. Yeah. Q, we have two questions here right at the front.
Juhana Vartiainen, Mayor of Helsinki. Director Rynning, you spoke interestingly on NATO leaders having become weaker. Now, should I think that this is just a phenomenon of politics, like politics becoming more populist or whatever politologists analyze? Or is this weakening perhaps a result of the security setup? With the fall of communism, there was less need to concentrate. There were no such existential threat. If the latter is true, then one might think that if the environment becomes more insecure again with Russia, even China, then the rational voter would again like to have a stronger leader. Thanks.
Anders Adlercreutz, Minister of European Affairs. In Finland, we tried very hard to avoid discussing NATO for many decades. We preferred talking about Nordic military cooperation, whatever that might mean on a practical level. We wanted to talk about the EU defense dimension, which also was a very vague subject. Now, of course, things have changed, and I wonder if we finally have gotten our house in order also on a European level, that we understand that NATO takes care of the military aspect, and then EU can handle maybe procurement. We can try to get our defense industry in order, trying to get the market functioning so that we can provide for an effective infrastructure so that NATO can do its job, preferably with a slightly more heavier EU component or European component than before. So that's one question. Another question is an American one. How concerned should we be about next year's election and what that might mean for NATO?
Thank you. And then we can take one. There's a microphone there already.
Hello, Jannis Sarts. I'm Director of NATO Strategic Communication Center of Excellence. Thank you very much for a very good talk. Of course, I will make an issue with the strategic concepts because I've had a chance to participate in writing one of two. I always considered the process actually far more important than the outcome, because that is how you come as allies at whatever number we are to a certain common understanding. What's the strategy we agree all to? Be it at the price of an elegant language. But my question is actually slightly in a different realm. As we've seen, this war, Russian aggression towards Ukraine, has started quite a number of new trends. And one of those is that countries like Japan, South Korea, Australia are seeking closer relationships with NATO. What do you think? What should we do as NATO? Should we let them closer? Should we take them at arm's length, given that our inability to actually, right now, to have full decision to accept Sweden as a full member? Or should we keep them at arm's length because of another element within the summits, which would add on to the burdens, as you just described, Sten? So what should be the best preferred option with dealing with these new interests of those countries? Thank you.
All right. We'll try to take a crack at these three. And I do have to agree, Nordic and European defense used to be what was talked about. I haven't heard mention of EU Article 42.7 since about spring 2022, but maybe this weekend.
Yeah, thank you. Fantastic questions. I would say Finland has played a very smart approach to its security and defense, building that web of security from territorial defense, its bilateral defense relationship with Sweden, with the Nordic countries, NORDEFCO, building JEF, that regional web, and then again, the next logical step, of course, was NATO. So all of that preparation was important. But I agree with you, the cultural, historical understanding of this is going to be the hardest approach to thinking that now I have to believe that my allies will come when I need, so I don't have to just be in territorial defense. I can be in certain areas, but I can also be a contributor. I think it's going to be a massive societal shift, and Finland's only been in NATO for 5 months. This does take a lot of time, but as I said, I think the Foreign and Security Policy White Paper setting this new tone is going to be really important. Surprises. Well, the good news is you will not be surprised like you were in 2016. You will be prepared if the former president is elected. It does not change the homework that needs to happen in Europe on security and defense. I appreciate the disquieting. I appreciate how the disruption will be, but it does not change the homework that we all must do. And perhaps this will be an opportunity for new political leaders to explain why allies are important. I hope so. I fear the polarization, but I am very hopeful. The question about the transatlantic and the trans-Pacific was a really important question. And this gets back to sort of that core competency. What are we trying to do here? And increasingly, because of Sino-Russian alignment, these two theaters have to work together seamlessly. You will hear voices in the United States, very senior, thoughtful voices, to say, we only focus on China in the United States. Everything else is a distraction. Everything else weakens us. I mean, some even advocate just pulling up wholesale and just focusing on the Indo-Pacific. It's not smart thinking, because we need Europe to understand the security dynamics, contribute where they can. We know their focus must lie in Europe. But this is why it's so important to have a NATO office in Tokyo, to bring in our Indo-Pacific colleagues. AUKUS is a perfect example of the unity of the US, Europe, and the Indo-Pacific in strengthening global security and defense. We have to help certain leaders to understand this is not a dilution of NATO's focus. It is an amplification of NATO's power. And Sam, as much as I know, I mean, obviously you're taking a critical lens at NATO and understanding that. There's a lot to criticize, so I'm not suggesting that. But the power of 31 leaders sitting at a table, and that split screen of President Putin meeting Kim Jong-un, an ally of one. This is our strength, but we have to invest in it. We have to harness it. I couldn't agree with you more. That is our strength. I sometimes think we don't appreciate that strength, nor do we invest in that strength as we should.
So many years ago, I interviewed a French diplomat at NATO headquarters, and I asked him, why doesn't NATO develop a China policy? And he replied, what should we be talking about? And I think that's a very good question. So yes, NATO should be talking to these Asian countries, not China in this case, but you have to define what you're going to talk about. And that is the challenge for your policy community. Summits will not tell you what we're going to talk about. The policy community has to drive some sort of conceptual, grounded thinking on what will NATO do with its partners. Will it contain? Will it engage? Will it build? These concepts will have to drive the relationship. But my answer will be, obviously, NATO will have to engage these countries. Ever since NATO developed its first generation of partnership policy, which was immediately after the end of the Cold War, that was all about countries on the approaches to NATO, to the east and to the south. Ever since then, all the generations of NATO partnership policy has been about NATO reaching out to countries the US and the United States found important. First in the Persian Gulf, then globally in the context of the war on terror, and now in the Indo-Pacific. The logic of NATO in this is that it has to support the US and its partnership policies elsewhere in the world for NATO to really get full credit of the transatlantic relationship. So obviously, yes, NATO has to do this, but a policy community will have to tell you what you're going to talk about. And on the Trump question, I think what we see and what has so clearly been President Biden's take on liberalism and the United States' back as a trusted partner. He fully recognizes that the crisis of liberalism, which I think is what we're living, cuts across the international domestic divide. All our domestic institutions in all allied countries, I cannot think of one allied country wherein a crisis of liberalism is not detracting from its governance capacity. All allied countries are living this crisis of liberalism and what it means for its capacity to lead internationally. Trump is the face of it in the United States, but I think it's very important for Europeans to keep in mind that they cannot hide behind Trump. And if there's a Trump 2 presidency, I think the brunt of it will be borne in the domestic debates you will have in your country on, are the institutions big enough for Trump, or is he bigger than the institutions? But it'll be mainly a domestic debate. Europeans tend to hide behind it and not take leadership of their own situations. And again, I think we see reruns of this in all our countries. A lot of it is linked to immigration and identity issues. We should do our homework before we really get into the throat of the United States on this. I think on the crisis of liberalism, we all have homework to do.
Well, one NATO partner member, Slovakia, will be having that moment as well. Yep. So we'll see.
Great. I wanted to comment on one thing about Finnish NATO membership, and I agree entirely that the cultural change is the biggest. Political, societal, military, including the use of the backbone of Finland's defense, that is the reservists. So I urge all non-Finns in the audience to pick a Finnish official or someone else and ask them, considering 95% of the field army is reservists and have other daytime jobs, how is Finland going to fulfill its land commitments to NATO? You'll get lots of different answers. First question from here, then I'd like the mic here to this table.
Thank you. Now it's working. Thanks. Jan Willem Rüpper, German Armed Forces. We heard a lot about speed and what we've already achieved. And we learn also, especially from the American perspective, that we have to do a lot more. My question is regarding, do we have to redefine the roles of NATO and European Union? Because we have only slightly mentioned European Union. What are the roles? So when we need to gain speed to deter deter Russia for a long time. Why not think about redefining the roles? What is NATO responsible for? What is EU responsible for? What is NATO good at? What is EU good at? So do you think we need to do it? Maybe on another summit, maybe the last one in the 20s, I don't know.
Right, and if I can add to that, as the microphone is traveling, part of deterrence is, or deterrence by denial, is resilience. What do you think the EU's role might have to be contra NATO's in building national and European resilience? And then we'll take the question here.
Good afternoon. I'm Olha Debrova, Ambassador of Ukraine to Finland and Iceland. The opening day of last year's Helsinki Security Forum appeared to be a remarkable day for Ukraine and NATO, because when we were here, following the similar panel, President Zelensky, live, was signing Ukraine's application to become a NATO member. So I have two questions to both speakers. Can you imagine Euro-Atlantic security without Ukraine? And second, do you think that Ukraine's membership in NATO is one of the critical prerequisites of just and lasting peace? Thank you.
All right. Who wants to take first crack?
All right, that's actually an easy one. So thank you for that question. I think it quite obviously Ukraine must be in NATO, and that must be part of a European settlement. That big question, I think you need to grapple with, and which NATO, as a can, kick down the road at the Vilnius summit. And by the way, the July summit next year will be very interesting because it will be in the run-up to the US presidential election. The Europeans are coming to town in Washington in July to be hammered on their defense contributions. And they need to be stand up and be counted to support Biden in the elections. So a lot of things will happen budget-wise until next summer. What will happen on the Ukraine dossier is really difficult to say because there was such a lack of clarity in Vilnius. But my answer would be clearly Ukraine is part of a European settlement. The other question concerned the European Union, and I think it's interesting that NATO is now getting into the technology business, the quantum and new technologies that affect its defense base and defense planning. I think it makes a lot of sense. But I also think we should not kid ourselves. That's just technology. When it comes to the way we produce wealth and live off our wealth, that's political economy, and that's the European Union. And if we are going to deal with China as a security risk, threat, challenge, that will be mainly anchored in a EU-US dialogue because it's about the political economy. There will be military implications as well, strategic implications, and they can be dealt with in NATO, of course. But China is bringing the political economy role of the EU to the table and requiring an EU-US dialogue. And that relationship will have to grow. I think on resilience, there's a pretty clear-cut division of labor between NATO and the EU. NATO does everything that's related to the movement of its forces. The EU does the rest. So it's a lot easier for NATO to do resilience than it is for the EU. But which just means that the EU is going to be a messy affair once again. But resilience is difficult. But it ties in with the political economy piece with China. And the EU dialogue on this will just be incredibly, incredibly important.
So, Sten, I will agree with you. The one frustration I have with the summitry is actually NATO-EU summits. That's my, because I would like less summits and more action. If you look, and this is where, when Sweden formally joins, with the exception of Austria, Ireland, Malta, and Cyprus, the EU is NATO, and NATO is the EU, with the exception of those 4 countries. So we're talking about the same thing, but everyone likes to count their forces very differently. And again, this is where the regional defense plans, there's no hiding here. Your forces, they will have to be dedicated, they will have to be put to the ready. Following the military mobilization, we still have challenges with military mobilization, moving forces rapidly across Europe. Now, as NATO has moved from a tripwire to those regional defense plans, you're going to see more forces, like the German brigade. You're going to see pre-positioning. You can't tripwire that. So speed will start to mean less, although it will always mean important things to surge that capacity. We're going to have to place more and more forces and equipment along the eastern flank. But absolutely, there is a huge role to play between NATO and the EU. I'd like us to move beyond the meetings, the smiles, the statements, and really move to that concrete action. We do need a robust European defense pillar in NATO. On Ukraine, absolutely. Ukraine has a vocation in NATO, full stop. We just can't see the path right now politically. And this is being at Vilnius and watching what happened. For me, Washington, that summit will be held 4 days before the Republican National Convention. This hyper-politicizes this question. The language in that communique will have to be agreed well in advance. And it will need to be clear and positive and what the politics allow. If we don't work that language out, similar to how it fell apart in Vilnius, it will be a political issue and really not good for anyone, and certainly not good for Ukraine. So look, we've got 3 big things to do in Washington: a new Secretary General, Sweden's arrival at the alliance, and that communique language. To me, for politics, that is the most important things we need to accomplish. But I'm going to pull on a thread you just said, because it makes me go, oh, we have to support Biden in these elections. The moment you make NATO a democratic policy, you're undercutting bipartisanship about NATO in the United States, and we desperately need bipartisanship. I need Republicans to see that U.S. national security is amplified in NATO. I need, to make sure Democrats. I just caution everyone. This has to be bipartisan. It's already becoming bitterly partisan. And that's not going to be successful for us in the long term. So while I understand 100% what you're saying, I'm not disagreeing with it. I'm just commenting that it's really important to make sure all Americans, regardless of political affiliation, see the value of NATO.
And the defense budget that's passed.
Yeah, no, so just to clarify, what I meant to say was that if European leaders would like to see Biden continue, then here's their opportunity to stand up and show that they can carry a defense burden as well. So with that, let me say about the NATO-EU thing, just very briefly, that NATO's first summit was in 1957, and it was a good occasion, but it failed. It failed because the Secretary General at the time, Paul-Henri Spaak of Belgium, who was a former prime minister, he wanted NATO to gain an economic dimension because he saw the importance of the political economy for the transatlantic relationship in the long future. And it was turned down for a number of reasons. And ever since then, NATO and the EC or the EU have been 2 individuals in, let's say, they're wedded, but they're also 2 individuals. So they're Mr. and Mrs. Johnson, but they're 2 individuals. And it's just really difficult because they're 2 different beings. And I'm sure Heather will come back and talk about NATO-EU in the future. It's not going to be an easy relationship, but they remain wedded, which is the good news.
Absolutely. Yes. I just want to, if people are increasing their defense spending for the United States, you're doing it for all the wrong reasons. NATO members took a pledge in 2014. If you didn't want to sign that pledge, you shouldn't have signed the pledge. It is holding people to their commitments. And this is about your defense. It is about our defense. And I know the cracking of the American whip on so many about this and using it so irresponsibly. But as I said, I'm going to keep coming back on this because it's such an important point. You have to do this for your own security and your own defense. It's not to please whomever is in the White House or who's not in the White House. And you have to live by those commitments. That's what's going to weaken NATO over time, not the arrival of a leader or the end of a leader. It's going to have to be that. And I just please, my silent plea, my loud plea is to make sure this is bipartisan and to live up to the commitments that NATO members have made.
All right. And I know the microphone has been passed out, but I also know that we need to soon get to a symbol of Finland's defense and European defense. But first I want to say thank you, Heather and Sten. This is exactly the kind of discussion and dialogue that we were looking for. So audience, please, could we have a great hand for the two of you? And with that, I close this first session of the Helsinki Security Forum. Thank you.